everybody, welcome to the video for Unit 2. This unit is going to be relatively short, but it's really important when we're talking about this third unit that's going to be coming up. So I would definitely pay attention to this. Before we get started, elephant in the room. Yes, I have my Eagles jersey on, and I'm sporting a Nick Foles jersey. Super Bowl champs 2017. Anyway, let's get started on Unit 2. So last we left off, we started talking about Europeans coming to the New World, engaging in the Columbian Exchange, the transfer of goods, diseases, religion, and so on and so forth. And in particular, we talked about the Spanish. We talked about the Spanish and how they had established colonies in North America and the southern parts of North America. When I say the southern parts of North America, I'm talking about what is today New Mexico, Arizona. And they established themselves primarily in Mexico and then in parts of South America. So we talked about the Spanish. They were incredibly important. Also, just as an aside, I really want you to remember that they had enslaved Native Americans and killed off populations and then used African slaves to supplement or take the place of these Native American slaves. They killed them off mainly because of disease and by superior weapons technology. So we're going to shift gears now and we're going to talk about one of Spain's biggest competitions in colonizing the New World. And we're going to talk about England. England is also known as Great Britain. So we're going to jump into British colonization right now. So before we get started, I think it's important to get some background on England. England is also known as the United Kingdom, and in the United Kingdom there are today 5 countries: England, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Wales, and Scotland. That's pictured right here. These are all very important areas. They are part of the British Empire, and in the 1600s and 1700s, England was a world dominant force. In particular, they had a very powerful navy that most countries could not match. We talked about Spain being a country that colonized in the New World. So why did England start? Well, to put it simply, England was competing with Spain. There are several reasons why England was competing with Spain. Probably most of all, because they wanted to colonize and they wanted to make money very much like the Spanish had been doing. But one particular reason why these two countries beefed with one another was over religion. You see, Spain was an incredibly Catholic nation. Catholicism was very widespread throughout Europe. Spain had adopted Catholicism as a state religion. And the king at the time, King Philip II, was very Catholic, and he listened to the Pope very, very much. Him and the Pope, who's the head of the Catholic Church, collaborated or made decisions together for Spain's empire. So Spain was raking in the money. And so England, on top of wanting to compete with Spain for money, one of the things that had happened was something called the Protestant Reformation. Now, the Protestant Reformation is a complicated topic, and I don't want to get too into it, but basically you have a guy named Martin Luther. Martin Luther was a guy who had a lot of complaints about how the Catholic Church was running. And so he developed what was known as his 99 Theses. And he took these theses and nailed them to church doors, and the Catholic Church was very, very angry about this. Martin Luther continued to push back against the church, and he was kicked out of the Catholic Church, so he formed his own religion called Lutheranism. Now, what does this guy have to do with England? Because I'm going to put it out there, Martin Luther was part of Germany, so he wasn't directly related to England at all. But what did happen that impacted England with the Protestant Reformation was very important, and we're going to talk about that right now. While Germany's going through the Protestant Reformation and people are adopting Lutheranism, and Spain and the Pope is getting all angry because of all these people leaving the Catholic Church and joining Lutheranism, we're going to go over to England now. England was doing great. They had a very good economy. They had a very strong navy, and they were a world superpower. And so one of the things that was a problem in England was the King of England. The King of England at the time was King Henry VIII, and he had a very, very kind of disturbing background, and I don't want to get into all of it, but basically what happened was he wanted to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon. King Henry and Catherine had tried to have children, and they tried to have a boy, but they were unsuccessful in having a boy. They did have a child named Mary. Now, the reason why this is important is eventually King Henry VIII started to get a little nervous because if he died, he would have nobody to take over the throne, particularly a male heir, so somebody to take over the throne. And so he decided he wanted to divorce his wife to try and marry somebody else. But divorce in the Catholic Church was very, very forbidden. And at this point in history, in the late 1500s, England was also a Catholic nation. However, when he asked the Pope for a divorce, the Pope denied him his request. And through a series of events, the Catholic Church and King Henry VIII began to beef, and King Henry VIII eventually formed his own religion called Anglicanism. That's spelled for you right there. Anglicanism was the official religion of England. Anglicanism, also known as, and this is a very important vocab term, the Church of England. Being that it was a state religion, meaning that the country had to practice this religion, the King or Queen of England would then become the head of the Church of England or the head of the Anglican Church. And so this is really important because it's a brand new religion that had formed in England. So what you have is England and Spain competing economically, but now King Philip II of Spain feels a certain way that King Henry VIII kind of abandoned Catholicism. So that was another underlying factor that caused them to beef. So England wanted to compete with Spain, and there was a company that had been created in England called the Virginia Company. And so this group from the Virginia Company landed in Jamestown in 1607. A lot of people died on their journey over, and when they got there, again, they found nothing but hard times. Eventually, though, they did kind of make it through the winter in 1607, and in 1608, Captain John Smith took over, and he began to bring order and structure to the colonies and said, those who do not work shall not eat. And so he brought a hard-nosed attitude towards the camp of Jamestown, and people began to become successful. However, before he took over, he was kidnapped in 1607 by the Powhatan tribe in Virginia. And he was scheduled to be executed, and the chief Powhatan of the Powhatan tribe was getting ready to execute him. And a woman, Native American from the Powhatan tribe named Pocahontas, came in and saved his life. And so the Disney movie that you guys may have seen depicts John Smith marrying Pocahontas, and that's just not true. There was a guy, his name was John Rolfe, okay? And John Rolfe came in to Jamestown and discovered this new type of tobacco that could grow in Jamestown to make it successful. And he was the one who, in fact, married Pocahontas and brought her back to England, and she died of disease. Terrible, terrible story. Anyway, in around 1610, you see the first war between the local Native Americans, the Powhatan tribe, and the British. And this war lasted for several years. There was large-scale fighting between the British colonizers and the Native Americans. Now, it's important here, the reason why I'm mentioning this is the British ended up winning and fought another war with them. But I'm saying all this to say because I really want you to understand. The British did not, I repeat, did not enslave the Native Americans like the Spanish did. I'll repeat that again. The British did not enslave Native Americans like the Spanish did. The British tactic was to kill Native Americans, take their land, and push them west. And I think that's very important that you know that, okay? Very important that you know that. John Rolfe introduces that tobacco, and Jamestown becomes a very successful colony. And in particular, colonies in that area, like Maryland and Delaware, become very successful tobacco colonies. Now, in Jamestown, you have a new structure of government created by the Virginia Company. And this government was called the House of Burgesses. Okay, and the House of Burgesses was the governmental body that made decisions for Virginia. The House of Burgesses did. And that's really important because 3,000 miles away in England, you have one person in charge of England, and that is the king. And the king was not very happy about the fact that the colonies of Virginia created their own government. And so in 1624, he decided to make Virginia a royal colony. In other words, England was taking over this colony. And so the House of Burgesses still did make decisions, but ultimately, if the king made a decision, the House of Burgesses had to acquiesce or give in to whatever the king had told them to do. While that was going down in the southern part of these colonies, in Virginia and Maryland and those such colonies, what you have up north about 12 years later in 1620 was a group of people who settled in the northern colonies. Now, These folks, you've heard of them before. They are known as the Pilgrims. They came over on the Mayflower and they set sail for the New World. But I think it's important we understand why these Pilgrims came to the New World. These Pilgrims came to the New World because they had large disagreements with the Church of England, which is what I mentioned earlier. The reason why they disagreed with the Church of England was because they believed that the Church of England's churches had become way too much about money. You go into those churches, they're super, super fancy, there's marble, there's gold everywhere. And these Pilgrims, also known as Puritans, which is spelled for you right here, believed that they should go back to the pure basics of religion and focus on the religion and not as much of the aesthetics or the rich, opulent decorations that were in these churches, and that the Church of England had strayed from the beliefs of what was important with religion. The Church of England did not like this, and England had begun to come after these Puritans or Pilgrims. So eventually, these Pilgrims took a trip to the New World, and it wasn't just a vacation. They had planned to settle there for good. They were aiming to go for Virginia, but they landed way off course in Boston, and this map right here shows you how far off they were. Anyway, they ended up landing in what is today Plymouth, Massachusetts, which is not far from Boston. A little bit more detailed map right here. They got there in the beginning of September, and for those folks who've never been to Boston or Massachusetts, it gets very cold very early on. And so as October and November rolled through, they really struggled to survive in Plymouth. And the local Native Americans began to help them and taught them how to plant crops and save crops over the winter. Eventually, they took part in what is today known as the First Thanksgiving. And just as an aside, the First Thanksgiving probably did not hold what we think of today as the meals. They probably had lobster, and they probably had duck, and turkey probably was not part of the meal. They had corn. So I think that it's really important that you know that this was the origins of the First Thanksgiving that has since changed today. Anyway, you have all of these Pilgrims establishing towns, and they came over for very religious reasons. And so there's a big difference between the Puritans and the way that they ran their churches and the Catholic Church. The center of every single New England town, like you see here, was the church. And I think that's really important because when we're talking about the church being the center of town life, that's where people came to make decisions about the town. Everybody would come and make decisions. And I think that's important because that's like a democratic way to do things. The people of a community making the decisions rather than one person like the king making decisions. So for instance, this town of Plymouth had their own what was known as a congregation. It's their own church. And you see this throughout Philadelphia today too. If you've seen Baptist churches or Lutheran churches or wherever, these churches operate independently of any central authority. Meaning if you have a church on Spring Garden in Philadelphia and they are a Baptist tabernacle church, that church is the one that operates, and there's no other larger group telling them what to do. That's really unlike Catholic churches, where any Catholic church throughout the city is run by the Catholic Church in general, and so it's very much controlled from the top down, much like a hierarchy. And that's not the case with the churches that were established by the Puritans. So these towns, the center of life was religion. And I really want to emphasize that the big difference between Plymouth and Jamestown was that Plymouth was started for religious reasons, and Jamestown was started for economic reasons. The Southern Colonies became major tobacco colonies where that was the main cash crop, where in the North they were focused on religion and building their lives that way. When we talk about England establishing colonies, it happened very different than Spain. Spain just began to expand their colonies by conquering and enslaving the Native Americans. And up north in Plymouth, with the Native Americans, that relationship eventually turned sour, and they pushed the Native Americans west. So what I really want to talk to you about is when the English settled in the New World, they started to work on North America, which is today the United States. And so you had the northern, middle, and southern colonies. I'm not going to go in depth with this because this is going to be an activity that you guys do that is going to be posted on Google Classroom. But the bottom line that I really want to emphasize is that the northern colonies, like I said, were very religious and came for religious reasons. Whereas the southern colonies were very much agricultural and in there to make money. So because these colonies, the northern colonies and southern colonies, were so different, they had different ways of making money and surviving. But before we get into that, I do want to talk very briefly about the middle colonies. The middle colonies were very, very different than the northern or southern colonies. The middle colonies were established by the Dutch early on, and eventually the British took over the Dutch colonies. I don't want to get into the history of that because that is details that we don't really need to know. But what I will say is that one of the people that we want to talk about is William Penn. William Penn was the person who established both Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, and he was a Quaker. And Quakers believed that all races, all peoples were equal and that nobody should be put in a position of inferiority, and that everybody should survive and everybody should thrive and everybody should be given freedom. One of the main crops of the middle colonies was wheat, and wheat is used to make bread. And so these middle colonies became the breadbasket colonies. And so that was their major form of making money. Now, in the southern colonies, like I said, it was tobacco, and I do want to talk about that real quick. In the southern colonies, to start off with, like I said, they did not use Native Americans as slaves. What they did do was bring something called indentured servants in. These indentured servants would sign a contract in England with a wealthy landowner. This wealthy landowner would own land in the southern colony. So the contract that was signed would be that these workers would agree to go over to the New World. The rich landowner would pay for their trip over to the New World. And the worker would work for a period of 4 to 7 years and give anything that they produced to the rich person. And the rich person would continue to take this money, and at the end of this contract, they would give a little bit of land to the indentured servant to kind of make their own life. Indentured servitude was a really terrible way of living. The lifestyle was awful, and you're going to read a source about it, but bottom line is indentured servitude was really, really bad. Eventually, people who were indentured servants began to realize how bad this system was, and so they stopped coming over. And so what you see after the indentured servants stopped coming over was the use of slave labor. There's a number of reasons why slaves were used, and I'm going to tell you about them right now. The first Africans came to Jamestown in the year 1619. It was a Dutch warship that had dropped off 32 Africans, and they were not slaves, but they weren't exactly free either. They were put into indentured servitude. So in about the 1680s, you see a shift from indentured servants to slave labor. So why did Africans become slaves? Well, there's a number of reasons. The first was in between 1680 and 1710, there was the creation of slave codes that took rights away from Africans and made them slaves. However, right around 1672, England got control of the slave trade, and so they began to bring over a lot more slaves. And as such, slaves became cheaper and more affordable for people in the New World. Additionally, like I said, people stopped volunteering to become indentured servants, so these rich landowners needed to supplement labor sources as well. And so, people began to use Africans as slaves. However, one of the biggest events that led to the switch to slave labor was something called Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. Basically, Bacon's Rebellion was a group of poor farmers not liking the way that they were being treated. As I said, rich landowners would pay people to come over to the New World, put them in a contract, and then when these indentured servants were done, they were given land. However, they were given land out west, and who was out west but the Native Americans? Native Americans who were out there got angry because they had already been kicked off their land. And so, what happened after they had gotten kicked off their land? We got this new group of people heading out west, and they run into Native Americans. Native Americans began to kill these poor people who had moved out west. These poor farmers went to the government in the House of Burgesses and asked for help against Native Americans. They said, "We need help. We're getting attacked by these Native Americans." And the rich landowners refused to help. So a guy by the name of Nathaniel Bacon, a poor farmer, took it upon himself to gather a bunch of men and go to Jamestown. And what they did was beyond protest. They burnt the entire thing to the ground. This really scared these rich landowners because they said, "Hey, these poor folks can rise up at any moment. So we need to do something to make them happy. So what did they do? They couldn't punish all the poor landowners, otherwise they might rise back up again. And so what the wealthy farmers did was they created a law in the House of Burgesses that any person of African descent was a slave. And this is really important because now you have these really poor white farmers who aren't getting punished, and they now have the ability to own slaves. And so instead of getting mad at the rich people, what they can do now is own slaves, and that's exactly what happened. Slave labor became the major source of labor. There was no more indentured servitude, and these folks realized, hey, all Africans are slaves. We can take these slaves. And they kind of forgot about the fact that the House of Burgesses would not help them fight against the Native Americans. And eventually that was taken care of. What I'm trying to say here is that this was one of the major reasons why Africans were used as slaves from about 1685 and onward in the Southern Colonies, and kind of impacts the use of slave labor going forward. And what also developed was something called the triangular trade. Basically, you had raw materials, and you see this image right here, raw materials like rice, tobacco, indigo, and other such crops going from the English colonies to England. England would take these goods, manufacture them, take the manufactured goods, sell them to Africans for slaves. Then slaves would be imported to the New World, and that cycle would continue. And each one of the areas of the world relied on one another. And I think that's really important when you're talking about the use of slave labor in the New World. Here is a quick diagram of the number of slaves in each colony, and if you take a look, the Southern Colonies definitely had more slaves than perhaps other colonies in the 1700s. So slavery was found in all colonies. However, the Southern Colonies really perfected the use of slave labor, and in particular, I think it's really important that you know in the Southern Colonies, they focused on creating plantations or farms that grew one crop, and in this case tobacco was the major cash crop. And so because they were on farms, there was a lower population and they needed people to do their work, and so they used slaves as a means to get that work done. That's why you see slavery mainly used down south, because there was these large farms used to grow one crop, and they decided that they needed slave labor to complete that work. In the middle colonies, like I said, William Penn did not believe in enslaving anybody. He didn't believe in killing Native Americans. He believed that everybody should be equal. So slave labor was found in the middle colonies, but not nearly as much. And there were slaves in the northern colonies. However, one of the last things I want to say is in the northern colonies, and this is going to really be impactful when we talk about events going forward. In the northern colonies, what you have is a focus on shipping and banking of the northern colonies. And remember, they were focused on building their own communities with religion, and so that was, to start with, at the beginning, the main focus. Eventually, the northern colonies do become a thriving financial area where money is made, but I think it's important that, to start off with, we understand how each set of colonies developed differently, and how England's colonization was very different than that of Spain's. And that's where we're going to end off.